Hey folks, I'm Leo Nikishin and this is 10 Rolls of Film. Welcome to part 2 of my series on using real Sony lenses on film. This time looking at the 50mm f1.8 DT SAM, probably the most common and affordable member of the Easy Choice range. Now, if you are like, what the hell is Easy Choice range and what do DT or SAM stand for? Pause this video right now and go watch part 1, link up here any second now. As I mentioned in the previous episode, one very likely source of inspiration for Sony's Easy Choice range was Canon EF 50mm f1.8, the epitome of an affordable, decidedly consumer grade, but still sufficiently fast and optically decent lens. And Canon clearly got something right with that lens. It remains incredibly popular to this day, despite having an optical design that hasn't changed much since 1987. And next only to kit lenses that are usually bundled with cameras, it is almost certainly the biggest selling autofocus Canon lens of all time. So it only makes sense that Sony would also create something similar for their budget-friendly line. Let's take a closer look. And, well, there isn't much to say really. It's pretty standard size for a moderately fast 50mm autofocus lens. It's made in China, weighs 170 grams, has 49mm filter thread. There are just two controls on the lens. One is a manual focus switch, because remember, unlike most Minolta lenses, this puppy has the autofocus motor built into it. And that's why the manual focus switch is on the lens itself. Do not use the manual focus switch on the camera. It will not disconnect the gears correctly and you can damage the mechanism. Second control we find here is a manual focus ring, which, as I mentioned before, is profoundly mediocre on all Easy Choice lenses. The overall build is entirely plastic, which doesn't sound great on paper, but actually, when used as intended in autofocus mode, the part you are holding the lens by is quite okay. At least nothing rattles or feels offensively cheap. Autofocus on my Dynex 5 is fairly consistent and snappy. There is a bit of a whirring sound to the focusing, which is higher pitched than I would like, but it's not that loud. Quick look at the lens diagram brings no surprises. 6 elements in 5 groups, the so-called double Gauss type of optical design, which has dominated the standard lens category for the last 60 years or so. No fancy aspherical lenses or low dispersion glass here. And image quality falls pretty much exactly where you would expect from a lens like this. A tad soft in the corners wide open, but sharpens up very nicely from about f2.8 onwards. The center is quite sharp, already wide open actually, and as long as you nail the focus properly, looks really nice. I also like that compared to a lot of older 50mm lenses from 70s and 80s and before, the Sony actually maintains a very decent amount of contrast wide open. Not too far from my much more modern and optically complex Lumix 50mm f1.8. I mainly shoot black and white film, so chromatic aberrations are not really an issue for me. But looking at my digital tests and also checking in with well-established lens reviewers like Optical Limits or Lens Tip, I don't see any problems in that area either. Next up, vignetting. Now this one is important because remember, according to Sony, this lens is marked DT because it is designed to only cover a smaller APS-C size or crop sensor. If that really is the case, then we should see some pretty severe vignetting on full-frame digital or a standard 35mm film frame, as they will be getting closer to the edge or possibly even exceed the image circle that this lens projects. Worst case scenario for lens coverage is usually wide open and focused at infinity, so that's exactly what I went for with my test shots. Is there vignetting? Absolutely. Is it noticeably more vignetting than I would expect from a proper full-frame lens? Not really. I think it's perfectly usable, and from about f4 is hardly an issue altogether. And that's at infinity. At closer focus distances, even f2 is not that bad. Finally, to everyone's favorite topic, bokeh. I'd say that as 50mm lenses go, the Sony falls in the middle of the pack. Background blur is not amazingly smooth, but it is not particularly busy or nervous either. You can provoke it into a bit of a swirl if you play your cards right, with specular highlights in the background, although even then, it's not too intrusive, at least to my eye. Sony heavily advertised the circular aperture in all the marketing material and even on the box of this lens. And sure enough, as long as you stay below f4 or so, the highlights do stay nice and round. Overall, I really enjoy the rendering of this lens. I would describe it as well-mannered, considerate, tasteful. It doesn't just plaster itself all over your frame. Looking at you, Helios44, it quietly comes in, greets you with a smile, and says, "May I?" A peculiar little note. When I use the Sony 50mm f1.8 on my Dynex-5, the widest indicated aperture on the camera's display is actually f1.7. So from the looks of it, what we have here is a full-frame 50mm f1.7 lens. Those of you familiar with the A-mount lens system must now be thinking, hold on Leo, didn't Minolta make a full-frame 50mm f1.7? And they sure did! Not only that, but as is often the case with affordable, moderately fast 50mm primes, it was also one of the most popular Minolta lenses. And yet, when Sony took over the A-mount in 2006, they did not rebrand the 50mm f1.7 and absorb it into the official Sony lens lineup. So what's going on here? Aha! I told you it was a Minolta lens. Well, not really. The two lenses definitely have a few things in common. Lens diagrams, for one, look pretty similar. Perhaps not quite similar enough to call them identical twins, but certainly sufficient to call them cousins. The Minolta is somewhat better built and has more metal in it. It is also slightly more compact, but actually weighs about the same. Looks like the autofocus motor in the Sony weighs about the same as the metal parts in the Minolta. The focus ring on the Minolta is smoother, but it is also narrower. Honestly, I wouldn't want to use either one of these lenses with manual focus a whole lot. Sony does have the Minolta beat on minimum focus distance. The Minolta can focus as close as 45 centimeters, while the Sony can keep going down to 34 centimeters, resulting in a pretty respectable 1:5 reproduction ratio. Not too bad for a non-macro lens. Now, design is subjective, and I know many people like the design of Minolta's autofocus lenses, especially the very popular and legendary beer can series. Personally, I'm not in that camp, and prefer the slightly cleaner, more modern look of the Sony. But again, this is highly subjective and certainly has nothing to do with optical performance. Talking about optical performance, I do not have the Minolta lens on hand for a direct comparison, but looking at examples online and recalling my own brief encounter with the Minolta lens, the overall image quality seems to be largely a draw, with the two lenses trading blows all day long. The Sony has perceivably better sharpness and contrast at wider apertures, while the Minolta is slightly sharper with top down. The Sony has better control of chromatic aberrations and flare, but Minolta has lower distortion and vignetting, and on it goes like this. So, which one should you get? Well, as is often the case, that's a question that only you can answer, as it depends on which qualities and features matter most to you. My personal preference is the Sony, and there are three main reasons for that. First, if I'm shooting with a fast 50mm prime, chances are that I'm shooting either in low light or in situations that tend to benefit from better subject separation. Things like environmental portraits or more static street scenes. So for the way I use a 50mm lens, the better optical performance at wider apertures and a subjectively more pleasing rendering and background blur do actually make a difference, as does a shorter minimum focus distance. Second reason is very subjective and is certainly up for debate, but I actually prefer the plastic build of the Sony. Now, hear me out. If I was shooting with something like a Dynex 9 or 7 or one of the higher end earlier Minolta models like the 9000 or the 800 SI, the metal-clad Minolta lens would have made a lot more sense, because then you have the camera that is built like a tank and then a lens that is built well enough to keep up. But I'm shooting with the Dynex 5, a compact, lightweight, fairly plasticky camera that I tend to treat as a generously proportioned point and shoot rather than a serious DSLR. DSLR, SLR, oh my god. So a sturdy, metal-clad lens just feels a bit incoherent on it. A bit overkill. Finally, the third reason I prefer the Sony is that I like unobvious left-field choices. I mean, look at my camera shelf. My TLR is an MPP microcord. My 6x6 SLR is a Kova. My main rangefinder is a Kiev. You get the idea. Now, it's important to note that these are not necessarily better choices per se. I just get an extra kick out of using something a bit quirky, a bit odd. And Sony Easy Choice lenses fit the bill perfectly. So join me next week when I look at quite possibly the most compelling member of the Easy Choice range, the Sony 85mm f2.8. That's it, folks. Hope you enjoyed the episode, and if you did, remember to like, comment, share and subscribe, as that would really help this channel grow. Till next time.